He stepped in first, held the door, she followed. The panel of buttons glowed softly, and then the doors slid shut with a quiet finality that stopped time. Mark stood there, completely still, staring at his own reflection in the polished brass. His legs felt like concrete. His chest felt like nothing. And here's the thing nobody tells you about the moment you confirm your worst fear. It doesn't come with screaming or drama or some cinematic breakdown. It comes with silence. Just you, your reflection, and the sound of everything you built together quietly collapsing inside your chest. He didn't follow them upstairs. He didn't need to. He'd already seen enough. Not just tonight, but across months of receipts and key cards and rehearsed lies delivered with a smile he used to trust completely. So he turned around, walked past the doorman, stepped out into the cold night air, drove home in silence, and sat at the kitchen table of the house they'd built together, her shoes by the door, the sonogram on the fridge, the baby blanket on the couch, and finally allowed himself to know what he'd been refusing to know for months. The foundation wasn't cracked. It was gone. And he was the last one to find out.
All right, settle in, because this story is going to hit different. We're talking about a guy who did everything right, and I mean everything. Stable career, beautiful home, loving wife, baby on the way. From the outside, his life looked like a Pinterest board that actually came true. But you know what they say. The cracks in a foundation are always invisible until the whole thing collapses on your head. Meet Mark, 38 years old, civil engineer based out of Denver, Colorado. This is a man who builds things for a living. Bridges, roads, infrastructure that holds entire communities together. He's the kind of guy who shows up on time, pays his taxes, holds the door open for strangers, and genuinely believes that if you treat people right, they'll treat you right back. Spoiler alert, he was wrong about that last part. Now, before we get into the absolute dumpster fire that his life became, let me paint you a picture of who Mark was. He wasn't flashy, no sports cars, no Instagram flexing, no bottle service at clubs. His idea of a perfect morning was strong black coffee, the sound of traffic outside, and the smell of concrete dust on his work boots. Blue-collar mindset with a white-collar salary. The man was grounded. His friends would describe him as loyal to a fault, and honestly, that was both his greatest strength and his biggest vulnerability. Because when you're the kind of person who trusts completely, who never second-guesses the people you love, you become the easiest target in the room. Mark met Emily at a community volunteer event. Classic wholesome origin story, right? She walked in carrying a box of cleaning supplies, hair in a ponytail, paint-stained sweatshirt, warm smile. They started talking about paint finishes for high-traffic walls, riveting stuff, and somehow neither of them wanted to stop. No awkward silences, no forced small talk, just two people who immediately clicked like they'd skipped the introduction phase and jumped straight into knowing each other. By the end of the day, Mark knew one thing for certain. He needed to see this woman again. And so it began. First date at a small Italian place downtown, the kind of spot with low lighting and fresh basil smell that makes everything feel cinematic. They traded childhood stories, laughed too loud, and lingered over dessert way longer than either of them had planned. By the time they stepped outside into the cool Denver air, it had stopped feeling like a date and started feeling like the beginning of something real. Here's the thing about Mark's story that makes it so painful to watch unfold. He wasn't naive. He wasn't some wide-eyed romantic ignoring red flags left and right. He was a thoughtful, deliberate guy who built things carefully, including relationships. He vetted this woman. He saw her at her worst, her most stressed, her most vulnerable, and she passed every single test, which is exactly what makes what comes next so brutal. Because sometimes the most dangerous betrayals aren't the ones you see coming from a mile away. They're the ones you never see coming at all, because they come from the person you trusted the most. Stay with me, this is only just getting started. So Mark and Emily dated for about a year before he decided she was it. Not in a desperate, please don't leave me kind of way, in the quiet, certain way that only shows up when you actually know someone. He'd seen her overcommit to every volunteer project in Denver until she ran herself ragged. He'd watched her laugh at herself when she made mistakes. He'd sat through her worst days and her best ones. And she knew him, too. The stubborn streak that came out whenever he thought he was right, which, in fairness, was most of the time. The work ethic that sometimes crossed into workaholism. The deep need to fix things that couldn't always be fixed. They weren't perfect for each other in a rom-com way. They were perfect for each other in a real way, which is actually harder to find. When Mark proposed, he didn't rent out a restaurant or hire a photographer. No flash mob, no viral moment. Just the two of them on her back porch after cooking dinner together. The Denver skyline going gold and pink in the sunset. He pulled out a simple ring, not extravagant, just right, and told her she'd changed his life. She was crying before he even finished the question. They didn't pop champagne or blast it on social media. They just sat there, hand in hand, letting the moment breathe. Their wedding was exactly the same vibe. Small, backyard, family and close friends only. Tulips and lilacs, a white arch wrapped in ivy, barefoot dancing on the grass under string lights. Not a ballroom in sight. Just real people, real love, real promises. And then came the house. A little two-bedroom in a quiet Denver neighborhood, walking distance from a park with tall cottonwood trees and a winding creek. The kitchen was outdated, the carpet had seen better decades, but the moment they stepped inside, it felt like theirs. They spent weekends painting walls, sanding cabinets, arguing about which couch to buy. Emily won, for the record. She insisted on a bright yellow front door. He built shelves from reclaimed wood he'd salvaged off a job site. Every nail hammered, every picture hung, it was all a stitch in the fabric they were weaving together. They settled into a routine that felt almost embarrassingly comfortable. Morning coffee and eggs at the kitchen table, Friday night movies on the couch under a blanket, Sunday lunches alternating between her parents and his. Nothing glamorous, just steady, warm, good. About 2 years in, the someday conversation about kids became a when conversation. They approached it the way Mark approached everything, methodically. Spreadsheets on daycare costs, discussions on pediatricians, mapping out parental leave schedules and college savings plans. The man literally made a project plan for parenthood. And when Emily came home one day hiding something behind her back, smiling that nervous smile, and he opened the small box to find a pair of tiny knitted baby shoes, Mark felt something crack open in his chest in the best possible way. "You're pregnant?" Half whisper, half shout. She nodded, tears everywhere. That night they sat on the couch with those tiny shoes between them, mapping out a future that felt more solid than anything Mark had ever built with concrete and rebar. He had absolutely no idea it was already built on sand.
Okay, so here's where the story gets genuinely sweet and painfully ironic in hindsight. Because the months leading up to the baby's arrival, by all appearances, they were perfect, like aggressively perfect. The kind of perfect that, looking back, starts to feel suspicious. They converted the spare bedroom into a nursery. Emily wanted soft yellow walls, warm and sunny without being overwhelming. They spent a whole Saturday taping edges and rolling paint, chatted about where the crib would go, what kind of curtains would work, whether they needed a rocking chair. They got the rocking chair, obviously. White wooden crib, matching dresser, animal print frames on the wall, a mobile with clouds and stars, a moon-shaped rug on the floor, every little detail placed like it meant something, because it did. At night, they'd stand in the nursery doorway just looking at it, not even talking sometimes, just absorbing the reality of what they were about to become. They went to prenatal classes at the community hospital every Wednesday. Mark took notes, like actual handwritten notes. He bought parenting books, stacks of them, and would highlight sections and share them with Emily like it was a book club. The man was so ready to be a dad, it was almost adorable. Baby showers, monthly bump photos, ultrasound appointments where Mark would hold Emily's hand in the dim room and tear up every single time he heard that tiny rapid heartbeat. And through all this anticipation and preparation and joy, Emily seemed completely, totally, utterly devoted. She'd reach for his hand on their evening walks, leave little notes in his lunch bag, cook candlelit dinners when he got home from work, write him messages like, "You're going to be an amazing dad." Here's the thing, though. Mark tells us that looking back, those extra gestures, the sudden surge of affection, the little notes, the romantic evenings, they didn't feel like love. They felt like guilt management. But he didn't know that yet. He was just a guy, head over heels in love with his pregnant wife, standing in a yellow nursery thinking he was the luckiest man alive. And the truly gut-wrenching part, there were no obvious red flags at this stage. No secretive phone calls he overheard, no dramatic mood swings he couldn't explain away with pregnancy hormones. If she came home tired, he figured it was the baby. If she was quiet some evenings, he assumed she was lost in thought about the future. He trusted her completely. And when you trust someone completely, you stop scanning for threats. You stop reading the room. You stop asking questions because why would you? Your life is good. Your marriage is solid. The nursery is yellow and the crib is white, and your wife leaves you little notes in your lunch bag. Why would you look for cracks in a foundation that feels this strong? But Mark, the civil engineer, the man who literally builds foundations for a living, he of all people should have known. The most dangerous cracks are the ones you can't see. They were already there, spreading, silent, and they were about to split everything wide open.
It started small, like it always does. A text message saying she'd be home a little late, wrapping up a project. Fine. Emily was always committed to her job. With maternity leave coming up, tying up loose ends made sense. Mark accepted it without a second thought. But then the late nights kept coming, more frequent, more regular. She'd roll in after he'd already eaten dinner, smelling faintly of takeout, brushing it off with casual explanations. Grabbed a bite with a coworker, big campaign deadline. The kind of answers that sound fine on the surface but have this slightly rehearsed quality if you listen close enough. Then came the receipt. Mark found it on the kitchen counter, folded up, left behind by accident. An upscale bistro downtown. 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, dessert. Dated the night she'd claimed to be working late at the office. He held it up casually and asked about it. She didn't flinch. "Oh, we were celebrating a small work win, just a coworker thing." No hesitation, no tells. Smooth as ice. Mark let it go, told himself not to be paranoid, but that night he replayed her answer over and over in his head. Then the stuff started appearing. A designer handbag in the closet, expensive, unexplained. High-end shoes tucked behind the laundry hamper, still in the box. These were people who were budgeting for a baby. Every dollar had a purpose. But Emily waved it off. The bag was on sale. The shoes were a gift from a friend. Maybe, but something wasn't adding up. The affection started cooling, too. She stopped reaching for his hand on walks. Goodnight kisses became quick and distracted, or skipped entirely. Movie nights, she'd sit with her phone face down, smiling at the screen at something she wouldn't share. When he asked, she'd say, "Nothing," and flip it over. He blamed hormones. He blamed stress. He blamed himself for being too sensitive. Then one evening, hanging up her coat, his hand felt something heavy in the pocket. A key card, branded with the name of an upscale downtown hotel, the kind with valet parking and a lobby that smells like fresh flowers. The date on the sleeve? From the week before, another supposed late night at the office. Mark slipped it back into the pocket before she noticed. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he opened the joint bank account. And there it was. Multiple charges to the same hotel over the past several months. Different dates, different amounts, but all adding up to a pattern that had absolutely nothing to do with being too tired to drive home. The most recent charge lined up exactly with the keycard he'd just found. His stomach dropped through the floor. He closed the laptop when Emily walked in, forced a smile when she asked if he wanted dinner. Played it cool, but inside something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't confused anymore. He wasn't telling himself he was overreacting. He wasn't looking for reassurance. He was collecting evidence. And the man who spent his career building things that would last, bridges, roads, foundations, was now quietly, methodically dismantling the lie that had been constructed right under his nose. The receipts were in, the charges were real, and the worst part was still coming. So at this point, Mark is living in this horrible limbo where he knows but doesn't have the full picture yet. He confronts Emily about the hotel charges, keeps his voice calm, almost conversational, because he's smart enough to know that if he comes in hot, she'll pivot to his behavior and he'll lose the thread entirely. Her response? Totally unbothered. Sometimes after working late, I'm too exhausted to drive home. It's easier to just get a room nearby and rest. Delivered while rinsing a plate. Barely looked up. Now here's the thing. If you're in a healthy relationship and your partner asks you why there are multiple hotel charges on the joint account, the answer probably involves some actual explanation. Maybe some apology for not mentioning it, some acknowledgement that, hey, spending money on hotels without saying anything is a little weird. Not Emily. Cool as a cucumber, moving on. But Mark couldn't move on because the story didn't hold. If she'd been too tired to drive, why not call him? He would have picked her up, no questions asked. That's the kind of husband he was. Then came the call from a coworker. Guy lived downtown, spotted Emily at a cafe near Union Station on a Saturday morning, sitting outside with a man he didn't recognize, close, laughing, leaning in. The coworker called Mark not to stir trouble, but because it was odd that Mark wasn't there. That same morning, Emily had told Mark she was running errands, maybe grabbing toast at home. When she got back, shopping bags dangling, completely casual, Mark asked, "Did you have breakfast this morning?" "Yeah, just at home, toast and coffee." No hesitation, smooth, automatic, like lying was just her default setting at this point. And that's when something clicked for Mark. It wasn't even about the lie itself, it was the ease of it. She wasn't nervous, wasn't over-explaining, wasn't avoiding eye contact. She was just lying, naturally, effortlessly, like it cost her absolutely nothing. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Mark connected every dot. Late nights, fancy dinner receipts for two, new clothes and perfume, hidden packages, hotel key cards, monthly hotel charges, a stranger at a cafe on a Saturday morning she said she spent at home. The picture was complete. He just hadn't confronted it yet. So he followed her. One evening when she said she'd be working late again, big project, tight deadline, might not be home till midnight, he waited 15 minutes, grabbed his keys, and tailed her car through Denver. They didn't go anywhere near her office. She drove straight downtown and pulled into the circular drive of the Grand Summit Hotel. Valet, polished brass doors, the whole deal. But here's the thing that really got him. She wasn't in work clothes. She was wearing a fitted navy dress he'd never seen before. Hair styled in soft waves, makeup perfect under the hotel lights. This wasn't someone too tired to drive home. This was someone who had planned every detail. Mark parked a block away and walked into the lobby, and what he saw next didn't leave any room for doubt, interpretation, or alternative explanations. It was just the truth, right there in front of him. Mark slips into the lobby and positions himself near a large potted plant, because apparently Denver's finest hotels are basically stocked with conveniently placed foliage for devastated husbands. He clocks Emily almost immediately. She's standing near the lounge entrance, scanning the crowd. A few seconds later, a man approaches, tall, well-dressed, confident in that quiet, easy way that tells you he's done this before. Emily's face lights up. Not the polite, "Oh great, my colleague is here" kind of light. The other kind. The kind Mark recognized because it used to be for him. The unguarded, genuine, full-face transformation that happens when someone you're genuinely crazy about walks into the room. They exchanged a few words Mark couldn't hear. The man leaned in slightly, resting a hand on her arm. She laughed, that real laugh, the one with the crinkled eyes, the one Mark had fallen for at a community center years ago, talking about paint finishes. She was giving it to someone else now. They moved to a tucked-away table in the lounge. Mark repositioned behind a marble pillar, close enough to see clearly. Emily was leaning in, elbows on the table, talking like she hadn't talked to Mark in months, engaged, present, alive. Then the man's hand slid across the table and rested lightly on her knee. She didn't pull away. Instead, she placed her hand over his, fingers curling, easy, natural.
the kind of touch that only exists between two people who've already crossed every line worth crossing. That gesture, that tiny, quiet gesture, hit harder than any argument or dramatic confession ever could. It wasn't passionate or desperate. It was comfortable. And somehow, comfortable was worse. After a while, they stood up. The man reached for her hand. She took it without hesitation, fingers interlacing like it was the most natural thing in the world. They walked across the polished marble floor toward the elevators, their reflections moving in perfect sync along the gold-trimmed doors. He stepped in first, held the door. She followed. The doors slid shut. Mark stood there, completely still, staring at his own reflection in the polished brass. He didn't follow them upstairs. He didn't need to. He wasn't there for more information. He'd just seen everything he needed, and then some. Here's the thing about moments like this. You can spend months suspecting, doubting, telling yourself you're being paranoid, and then one moment obliterates all of it. Not with a bombshell announcement or a dramatic confrontation, just with a closed elevator door and the quiet certainty of knowing. He turned and walked out of the hotel. The doorman gave him a polite nod. The cool night air hit him like a slap. He walked back to his car, drove home in complete silence, no radio, no podcasts, nothing, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the walls of the house they'd built together. Her shoes were by the door. The sonogram photo was pinned to the fridge. Her half-finished baby blanket was draped over the couch. And Mark sat in the middle of all of it, in the house he'd built, in the life he'd designed, finally understanding that the foundation he'd trusted completely had been rotten for a very long time. The question now wasn't whether it was happening. The question was, what do you do when the whole structure has to come down?
Mark didn't sleep. By the time Emily walked in the next morning, 9 a.m., still in the navy dress, keys in hand, he was already sitting in the living room, suitcase packed and parked beside his chair. She froze in the doorway, forced a smile. "Hey, you're up early." Set her purse on the counter, slipped off her heels, started moving around the room like this was any other morning, but her eyes kept drifting to that suitcase, and you could see the calculation happening behind them, trying to figure out which version of the story still had legs. "I thought you were working late last night," Mark said, voice low, steady. "I was," she replied, not meeting his eyes, heading toward the kitchen. "Don't." That stopped her cold. "I followed you last night." The air in the room changed. He laid it all out. The Grand Summit Hotel, the lobby, the man, the hand on the knee, the elevator, and before that, the hotel key card in her coat pocket, the months of charges in their joint account, the dinner receipts for two, the new clothes, the lies stacked on top of lies like structural supports in a building that was never going to hold. By the time he finished, she was gripping the kitchen counter hard enough to whiten her knuckles. And then, because this is apparently the playbook, she went on offense. "Are you seriously spying on me? Following me around? Going through our bank account like some kind of detective?" Her voice rose, sharp and indignant, crossed her arms, leaned into the performance. "Do you have any idea how controlling you sound?" Here's the thing about that move. It might have worked 6 months ago. It might have sent Mark spiraling into self-doubt, apologizing for noticing. But he'd run out of doubt. There was nothing left to spiral into. "I'm not guessing, Emily. I saw you." That landed. The fight drained out of her like air from a punctured tire. And then, quietly, almost a whisper, she said it. "It's true. I've been seeing someone." There it is. Mark said his ears rang. That for a second, even though he'd known for weeks, hearing it spoken out loud felt like a fresh punch. She started in with the explanations, how it just happened, how she hadn't meant for it to go that far, how she'd been feeling neglected, how she needed someone to talk to. The greatest hits, every cheater's comfort playlist. And then Mark asked the question that had probably been living in the back of his mind since the moment the doubts began. "Is the baby mine?" Emily froze. That pause, That split-second hesitation before she answered told him everything before the words even came out. I don't know. 3 words, 4 syllables, completely rewriting the past 9 months. Every ultrasound, every 2 a.m. kick he'd pressed his palm against, every name on the list they'd argued over playfully, every moment in that yellow nursery, all of it now suspended in uncertainty. Mark stood there in his own kitchen, in his own home, and made the only decision that made any sense anymore. I'm filing for divorce. Not yelled, not dramatic, just stated, like a man who'd already processed the grief and had come out the other side holding a plan. The chapter was over. Time to close the book.
Here's where it gets genuinely complicated. Weeks pass. Mark moves into the guest room. They exist in the same house like 2 strangers who happen to share a mortgage, speaking only in logistics. Mail's on the counter, your parents called, dinner's in the fridge, every sentence carrying the weight of everything they aren't saying. His lawyer files the paperwork, Emily gets served. The divorce process begins. And then, because life doesn't pause for legal proceedings, Emily goes into labor. Mark gets the call, and he goes. Look, you might be sitting there thinking, why would he go after everything? And honestly, that's a fair question. But Mark explains it simply. Part of him needed to know. And regardless of the paternity situation, walking away from a delivery room entirely didn't sit right with him as a human being. So he shows up, stands against the wall with his hands in his jacket pockets, out of the way, while nurses move efficiently and machines beep, and Emily doesn't look at him much. Hours later, a newborn's cry fills the room. The nurse eventually places the baby in Mark's arms. He looks down, and his heart sinks. He told himself not to assume. He'd read about genetics being unpredictable, about traits skipping generations, about how you couldn't know just by looking. He'd given himself every out available. But there were no outs left. The baby was beautiful, genuinely, purely, heartbreakingly beautiful. Tiny dark curls, warm bronze skin, perfect little features. But she shared absolutely nothing visually with Mark, a man with pale skin and light eyes who comes from a family that looks nothing like this child. He stood there, holding this innocent little girl who had done absolutely nothing wrong, and felt 2 completely separate things at once. A tenderness for the baby that surprised him, because she was just a baby, and a grief so specific and sharp it almost took his legs out from under him. This child's existence was confirmation. Emily stared at the hospital sheets. Mark handed the baby back gently, walked to the corner of the room, and focused on breathing. 2 days later, he went back to the hospital alone to do the swab for a paternity test. Quick, clinical, quiet. The nurse explained the process, both samples taken. Results would come back within days. Mark sat in his car in the parking lot afterward and just sat there. When the results arrived, the number was blunt and final. 0%. He'd already known, but knowing and seeing it printed are 2 entirely different gut punches. He sat in that parking lot with the paper trembling slightly in his hands and let himself feel it, really feel it one more time. The future he'd mapped out in that yellow nursery, the name lists, the prenatal classes, the tiny knitted shoes in the gift box. None of it was his. All of it had been built on a lie. And then, and this is the part that separates people who get consumed by betrayal from people who survive it, he folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, started the car, and drove to his lawyer's office. Because the building had come down, and Mark was already thinking about what to build next. The legal process moved faster than Mark expected. Turns out, documented infidelity and a DNA test that reads like a nope notice from science tends to streamline things. His lawyer filed everything. Emily was served, the court date came, and it was almost anticlimactic. 20 minutes in front of a judge, a few signatures, a brief reading of terms. The house went to Emily. Mark didn't fight it. He didn't want it. Every room was a ghost. He took a share of the savings, signed his name where it needed signing, and walked out of that courthouse lighter in some ways, and carrying a specific, particular kind of sadness that doesn't have a clean name. You know what that sadness is? It's not grief for Emily specifically. It's grief for the version of your life you thought you were living, for the reality that turned out to be fiction,
for the yellow nursery and the tiny shoes and the ultrasound pinned to the fridge. Mark let himself feel that. He didn't try to rush past it or logic his way out of it. A few days later, Emily showed up at his new apartment unannounced, eyes swollen, clutching a crumpled tissue, the whole performance. She said she'd made a horrible mistake, that she wanted to try again, that he should stay, for the baby, for everything they'd had. He let her talk, let her finish every sentence. Then he said, "I can't. There's no trust left. Without that, there's nothing." She cried harder. He closed the door. Gently, but firmly. Not cruelty, clarity. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it from the outside. Mark found a small one-bedroom apartment across town. Clean walls, good light, no memories hiding in the corners. Moving day was quiet. A couple of friends, some boxes, no drama. First night in the new place, takeout pizza on the floor, a single lamp, city traffic through the open window. And for the first time in months, he could breathe without scanning the room. He booked therapy. First session was awkward as hell. Sitting across from a stranger describing the worst year of your life is not exactly comfortable. But week by week, he started unpacking things he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The betrayal, the anger, the specific shame that comes from feeling like a fool even when you're the one who was lied to. His therapist helped him understand something important. Healing isn't about deleting the past. It's about learning to live without being controlled by it. Meanwhile, he went back to work, threw himself into projects, reconnected with friends he'd drifted from during the marriage, started hiking again, real hikes, up into the Rockies, where the air is sharp and cold and your lungs have to work, and it turns out that's a solid metaphor for the whole rebuilding process. He pulled his old easel out of a closet, started painting, not for anyone, not for any reason, just because it was his. Eventually, word filtered back through mutual acquaintances. Emily was struggling. The man she'd upended her marriage for had long since disappeared. She was navigating single motherhood with limited support and tight finances. Mark felt a complicated mix of sadness and relief. He wished her no harm. He also thanked everything he had that he wasn't there to fix it. Here's where I'm going to stop narrating Mark's story and just talk to you directly for a minute. Because this story, as specific and devastating as it is, isn't actually that rare. The details vary, the genders switch, the timelines are different, but the core of it, building something with someone, trusting them completely, and then watching them dismantle it from the inside while you had no idea, that hits people all over the world, every single day. And the part that really gets me about Mark's story isn't the betrayal itself, it's the loyalty trap. Mark was the kind of person who trusted completely, and that became the very thing that made him easy to deceive. He saw the late nights and made excuses for them. He found the hotel receipt and gave her the benefit of the doubt. He noticed the emotional distance and blamed it on pregnancy hormones. He wanted to believe the story he'd been sold, so he kept buying it even when it had stopped making sense. That's not stupidity. That's love. That's what love does. It makes you generous with interpretation. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Generosity has limits, and knowing where those limits are isn't being controlling or paranoid. It's called self-respect. Mark eventually found Claire, someone steady and genuine who responded to his painful history not with pity, but with patience. He took it slow. He rebuilt. He proved to himself, and this is the important part, that the betrayal was about Emily's choices, not about his worth. That distinction matters enormously, because when something this catastrophic happens, the most insidious damage isn't the broken trust, or the legal costs, or even the grief. It's the quiet voice that starts asking, "What's wrong with me? Why wasn't I enough?" And the answer, the honest, actual answer, is that some people's choices have nothing to do with your adequacy as a partner. Some people are just making choices, selfish ones, and no amount of being a better husband, a more attentive boyfriend, a more patient friend would have changed that. Mark said something at the end of his account that stuck with me. He said betrayal didn't get to write the rest of his story, that it ended a chapter, a significant, painful, genuinely formative chapter,
but not the book. The pen was still in his hand. And look, I know some of you watching this are either going through something like this, coming out the other side of something like this, or know someone who is. And I'm not going to stand here and give you a 5-step program to healing, because that's not how it works, and anyone who tells you it is trying to sell you something. What I will say is this: the fact that someone chose to blow up your life doesn't mean you are broken. It means they made a choice, a terrible one. And your job, your only job, is to decide what you build next. Mark built something better. Not immediately, not without scars, but genuinely, measurably, undeniably better. And if you've been through your own version of this story, drop it in the comments, not because misery loves company, but because someone out there right now needs to know they're going to make it through. They're going to make it through.